inspired, fired up, and on the move. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the places and all the races, arm in arm now, upon our feet. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the schools and all the homes, it's time to take it. It's time to take it to the street.
Gonna get militant up in here. And welcome once again to this week's episode of The Call, the program that calls you to action, it calls you to advocacy, it calls you to do any direct action and education of yourself and communities that will help us create a better world. And our guest today is Dr. Kwadwo Gallman, who is the board member for ASCA, and we're so glad to have him. He is a very renowned historian and expert on Black culture, Black history, and I say the word Black, but really we mean African, and talking about Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora. And so glad to have you, Doctor. And why don't you tell us about your organization that you're on the board? And I know there's so many of this, but just give some people some background about the groups you work with, and also how did you get started in this whole thing of African studies and unveiling the truth?
That's thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate you having me. I'm a member of the National Board of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, or ASCAC, which is an umbrella organization of study groups internationally. And this organization actually played a big part in getting me to where I am. I first became interested in our history. Well, going back, when I was in undergraduate school, I heard Stokely Carmichael, and Stokely Carmichael touched something in me that I didn't know was there. And when I left undergraduate and went to medical school in Philadelphia, I was fortunate enough to live a couple of blocks from a Black bookstore. Now, I'm a native of Hartsville, South Carolina, so the idea of there being a Black bookstore was a little foreign to me at that time. So I used to go in there just to walk around and bask in everything. And I got familiarized with the writings of people like Sonia Sanchez and Don L. Lee, who later became Hakeem Madhubuti and created the Third World Press in Chicago. I also at that time became familiarized with the works of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Well, because of my studies, I wasn't able to really put in as much time as I would have liked toward that end. So when I finished my training and moved back to South Carolina, I decided to have a family reunion for my mother's side of the family. And in part of that, I decided to write family history. In order to spice it up, I actually decided to look up some historical events and say, yeah, my grandfather was born this year and this was happening in the country and the world when my grandfather was born. At the same time, I was fortunate enough to meet and become very close to a brother by the name of Listervelt Middleton, who had a program on South Carolina ETV called For the People. And what Listervelt did was he would interview scholars like Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Ivan Van Sertimer, Dr. Charles Finch, Dr. Marimba Ani, and many, many others. And I got an opportunity not only to listen to them, but to meet them. And actually, over the course of the next few years, became quite close to many of them. It was through Listerville that I found out about ASCAC, and we had started a study group here in Columbia, and they were having their Southern Region meeting in Miami. So we sent 2 delegates, myself and a brother by the name of Randolph Scott, Ma'akaru. He is an ancestor now. But we were very impressed with what we encountered, and we became involved. And South Carolina had no presence in the organization at that time. And we ultimately created, I think, probably like 12, 15 different study groups throughout the state. Columbia, Charleston, Camden, Spartanburg, Myrtle Beach, and we even had a group in Florence. So attending those conferences and reading books and studying over time is how I got to where I am today.
Great. And you mentioned a lot of names that are, now historical figures and cultural icons. And, I was very blessed that as a child in New York City, my parents saw a book that was advertised in Ebony magazine, Before the Mayflower, and by Lerone Bennett Jr., and bought it when I was about 14, and it told the whole history of Africa way back then. Talked about how civilization began in Africa and all the accomplishments all the way up to the 60s. And I have an uncle, my Uncle Malachi, who will be 100 years old. He worked in County Cullen Library in Harlem, where many of the things that are in the Schomburg Museum today, was kept at that time. And so at a very young age, I learned a lot about Black history, or African history, which is the correct term. But I want to kind of look at today, because, there's that very famous saying that people who don't know their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And so there's a lot of conversation today around racial justice, a lot of conversation today around how we can dismantle racism. And we have Black Lives Matter and all these organizations and businesses who suddenly want to make sure racial justice happens. But if you know the history of Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, which is dispersed throughout the world, then you realize that very few people know the history in which racism was first brought about as a social construct. You're correct?
Absolutely. There is but one race, and that's the human race. It's interesting because there are several theories as to the origins of racism. One theory is the one that was put forth by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who, in her Cress theory of racism, white supremacy, uses a genetic type of argument. And historical, because she's saying that everything that defines whiteness physically is genetic recessive. And everything that defines Blackness is a genetic dominance, so that theoretically, from a genetic perspective, if whites and Blacks were freely to cohabitate, we could literally love them out of existence.
Absolutely.
And what happens is that her main theory is that racism evolved from a desire for white genetic survival. And they had to do that. Another theory is a theory by Dr. Shekanta Diop, which evolved from his two cradle theory. Now, there is no argument from most scientists that environment determines appearance.
Absolutely.
Those people in the sun tend to be, in fact, there's a law called Gloger's law, which says that any warm-blooded animal in a temperate or tropical environment will have pigment. So when the Africans who evolved in Africa started moving out, they moved to Europe and got caught up in the last ice age, which is called the Worm, W-U-R-M, glacial age, which lasted maybe about 100, 150,000 years. But during that period of time, those Africans who were pigmented went through the genetic changes that Dr. Welsing mentions, and they lost pigment. The noses narrowed because for survival, they couldn't continue to breathe that frigid air and so forth. So they became what we now call white. But what Dr. Diop says is that aside, even though that's accepted, he says that the climate also caused mutations in worldview and the way that they conducted themselves, in that they became more aggressive, they became more patriarchal, they became more violent, they became so misogynistic, and which is what we see now.
Absolutely.
Evolving. So then the third theory is one that has been discussed over the years, but recently I think it's been discussed most recently by Ibram X. Kendi. And he says that it was purely economic, that racism evolved as a purely economic way of justifying the enslavement and brutal treatment of African people. So that's those are the three theories that I'm aware of the origins of racism.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
as you say, I think that racism is permanent, even though it's not a physical reality or a genetic reality. It is a social construct. But what I like to say is that it's in the water, in the dirt, and in the air of America. And unless we eliminate water, dirt, and air, we're not going to eliminate racism.
Right. And I agree with you on all three of those, because we know civilization began in Africa. We know that the genetic dominance of people of color, right, often overwhelms people who don't have melanin, and people get darker and darker, and we see that in multiracial people. And so I believe in both of in all three of those theories, and the mindset that the social actions of white people come from the fact that they lived on a cold, frigid continent where food is not in great abundance, animals not in great abundance. And for survival, they had to have small groups of people where the nuclear family came from. But in a lush environment, such as on the continent of Africa, there's more collective effort and work, because there's so much abundance that people have to work together in larger groups. And then for the economic one, I really see where that construct got developed and amplified for colonialism and slavery. So Henry the Navigator, in history, we don't know if he actually went around the continent of Africa. We know that he had a lot of maps from both Africa and China, and that advances in sailing technology pretty much opened up the gates so that Europeans were no longer limited to Europe, Northern Africa, and the Mediterranean. But they developed the Atlantean sails and other technologies so that they could travel further. And, historically, we know that the Pope Innocent, Pope Pius V, and others, when slavery was first introduced to the Catholic Church, they thought it was a good thing, as Dr. Claude Anderson says. And they decided that to say, okay, people are no longer slaves temporarily because they're debtors or because they're prisoners of war, but instead they said, let's make slavery permanent based on the fact that these people are not European and they're not Christians. And because the monarchy, the royalty of Europe, ruled by something they call divine right, that the popes had to actually support the notion that certain kings and queens were ordained by God to rule. They needed to make that connection. And so after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella pushed out the last of the Moors out of Spain, and they could now go out into the world. In 1493, they came up with something called the Doctrine of Discovery, and that said that any country that Europeans supposedly discovered, that if the inhabitants were not Christians, they had no title to land and no title to personhood. And I think that's important, especially when we look at Europe and America, because we see that repeated all throughout history. No title to the land, no 40 acres and a mule, redlining districts, placing polluting facilities in Black communities, because there and no respect of title to personhood, from the time we were counted as 3/5 of a person to the fact that with police shootings and other things today, we're not considered human beings. And so that evolution over time, that those historical roots over time are still, to me, blossoming today. And people who don't know that, and I'm talking about people of color, particularly Black folks of African descent, you are not going to guilt trip white people into dismantling racism by letting them know what their ancestors did, while we still are subjected to not having title to land, not having title to our personhood. I just want to know, is that something you agree with? Along with that, that's one of three of the theories of how racism is a social construct. But I'm interested because you said there'll always be racism.
Yeah, you touched on several points I'd like to enlarge on, though, if I may. Going back, this whole thing of living in the ice, there are two things that we see in Western culture now. We see a worship of youth, whereas in Africa, elders are respected and people look forward to becoming elders. But there's a multi-billion-dollar industry to retain the appearance of youth. And it's such a youth-oriented society. People say you have people that don't even like to be called old. And the devaluation of women. You know, the interesting thing is that in the devaluation of women, what we found is that, let me move. In the devaluation of women, what we find is that during the ice, women were seen as being drained on the group. You know, they weren't able to hunt or move as well, so that frequently, when girls were born, they were what we call exposed, meaning they were left for the animals to kill. And you fast forward down to the era that you were talking about with the popes. I think there were two popes, both named Nicholas. I think it was Nicholas II and Nicholas III, or either third or the fourth, that both came out with papal bulls when Spain and Portugal were beefing about the ability to take over the so-called New World. These papal bulls, and I think one paraphrase it says, you know, you go and enslave the infidel. And what they did was they divided the Northern Hemisphere into Spanish and French. That's why Brazil, which is a humongous place, is mostly Portuguese, and much of the Caribbean is Spanish. And then the English came in and took over, just like dogs fighting over a bone. The idea of moral suasion is something that goes back since you had Africans in America. You had Africans like Frederick Douglass, who believed that if you showed these people the error of their ways, they would repent and free all the enslaved Africans that they had. And we know that it didn't happen. And that was an ongoing argument during the early part of the 19th century. I don't like to say free Africans. One of my brothers, who is now an ancestor, Joe E. Benton, used to say Africans wasn't free, they were loose. And those Africans who were not enslaved used to have what they call conventions. And in the convention movement, there arose two basic sides. There were the nationalists, and then there were the integrationists or accommodationists. And the accommodationists, like Frederick Douglass, believed in moral suasion. They believed that white folks could be persuaded not to be white folks. Whereas the nationalists said, were led by people that I, and who were written out of history, but people that I admire greatly, like Martin Delany and Henry Highland Garnett. You know, they were saying, you know, Garnett made a speech and saying, you know, we need to go and fight for the freedom of our brothers, because they can't treat you no worse than they already do. And better to die than to live to be a slave. So those were arguments that have been going on for over 100 years in this country. And unfortunately, we still have Negroes who feel like they can gain from, you know, and the motivation probably varies. You have some people who genuinely and sincerely feel that that moral suasion will work. And then you have those that are more nefarious, that have greed in their heart, and they're trying to get rich quick or accrue more privileges. So
Right.
it's very interesting.
And that's a big problem today. And see, you raised a good point, because those who wanted to work within the system and thought that, and still think that moral, persuasion will cause racism to wither away. Very few people in this country, including people of African descent, know about, the Martin Delaney's, know about Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, know about these folks that you name that actually had a different vision of how we went about gaining our freedom. And you talk about people who, let's look at, one of my friends said, let's have some real talk, okay? As long as you do not control land, which is the means of production, where all of our food comes from, the clothing we wear, building materials, everything comes from the land. As long as you do not own land, you will always be beholden to the people that control it. And so what we have are a lot of people, like you said, many with good intentions, who feel that if we can gain a position, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, if we can gain a position within white-led organization, that's how we become free. And I don't, I have very good friends who I encourage them, please join. You can change the culture, you can make advances, but the bottom line is that benefits a select group of people. And even with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the rest of this, the collective masses of people of African descent in this country has not improved. That in fact, we're watching things go back. And so it's not about a few people elevating themselves, I say, or moving from the field to the house, to use that plantation analogy. But it's also about using your position if you are inside, if you are a civil servant in a colonial society, if you are within in these white-led organizations, your job is not only to make sure that you benefit and your colleagues benefit, but that you make sure that we are benefiting and elevating the masses of people of African descent in this country. And so you made a lot of good points, but there's another one I want to look at, because we have always been competing with other people in this country for resources, for recognition, etc. And Dr. Claude Anderson always talks about how people of African descent are always more focused on saving other people and communities than themselves. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we have conflated and confused the whole situation with people who come from certain ethnic groups or certain nationalities who are competing with us on racial issues, because I don't believe that people of different nationalities or ethnic groups should be just bundled together with people who are suffering from racial exploitation, oppression, etc. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about the fact that what is nationalism and ethnicity, and you know, uh, are these racial groups or not?
Well, that's a good point. I think that we need, I, I think about one of the things that my teacher, Dr. Asa Hilliard, used to always say. We can talk race, and since it was brought up by them, we won't ignore it. But unless we win the cultural war, then politics, economics won't make any difference at all. And
Now, what
so
cultural war? What do you mean by cultural war?
the fact is that something you said early on, we don't know who we are. You know, we have bought into this concept of African American as if that's something completely different from African. Now, I will say that if you look at ethnicities, we are a new ethnicity because so many of us are mixed with so many different types of African people as well as others. But based on the one drop rule, we're all seen as African people.
Mhm.
And what's interesting
That's
is
a
that,
slave master. That's a slave master's definition of who Black is. Genetically, scientifically, it's not realistic. I mean, if we did a DNA test on President Obama, we may find that he's 51% or 55% European and not predominantly of African descent. And I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
not
I
a
always
problem.
bring that point up to people that one drop of Black blood making you Black is the slave master's definition of who's Black.
Well, it was a strategy because actually, if you go to some parts of South America, the one drop rule was used, but it was a different, it was completely opposite. If you had one drop of white blood, they considered you white.
Mhm.
That's why today, if you go to Argentina and you look at the statistics, they might have 2-3% Blacks in the country, but if you walk down the street, you'll see plenty of us.
Mhm.
But they are defined differently based on that. As you say, the slave masters' way of retaining dominance.
Mhm.
Um, you know, but when I talk about culture, when our ancestors were kidnapped and brought here to be enslaved, and I don't like to use the word slaves because slaves were not brought to America. Africans were brought to America
Mhm.
and turned into slaves. So when our ancestors got here, they came with the culture. Now, I've gotten into debates. I am chairman of the board of an organization called the South Carolina Organization of African Unity, which is made up of Africans from about 17 different African nations, Africans from America, Africans from Haiti, Africans from Jamaica. And one of the big debates that I have with some of the continental Africans is the fact that there is, they like to say that there is no single African culture. And I take exception to that based on the work of Dr. Wade Nobles, because there's one basic African culture, but it has many different customs within it. You know, we're not talking about something as superficial as food or music or dance. I'm talking about things like epistemology, where you evaluate the nature of knowledge. How do you know? You know, white folks or European culture teaches that unless you can measure it or weigh it, it don't exist.
Or spend it.
Where or spend it. Whereas we as Africans understand that there's reality that's way beyond the material. We understand that there's a spirit. Even think of an example. Winos know that there's a spirit around them. That's why they pour libation. Now, is interestingly enough, that is one of the points that I've made, that I've been able to work with these Africans, and that is all over the African continent, libations are poured, but everybody does it differently. I participated in a ceremony not too long ago. It was a naming ceremony, and I was honored to be one of the elders at that ceremony. And one of the young men, who was Nigerian, he was an Igbo from Nigeria, was very upset because the libation was poured using water. He was saying, you have to use gin. And the point that I made to him was, as long as it's a libation, it really doesn't matter. And what did you know about, what did Africans know about gin before the Europeans brought it there?
Maybe palm wine, but not gin.
Exactly, exactly. So, and you look at the deep structure with ideology, epistemology, and actually in my last book, I have a chapter dealing with that. That two cradle theory and how it has played out for us.
Tell the name of the book, Doctor. Sell some books.
Oh, okay. I just happen to have one here.
Okay.
Can you see it? Let me see. Well, the name of it is Sankofa University, Studying African-Centered History and Culture. It's available on Amazon, and I'd like to think that a lot of Black bookstores have it yet, but I'm not sure. It's still relatively new, but I know that it's available at Amazon. And what's the other big bookseller?
eBay.
No, not
eBay. I'm sorry. Amazon. What else they have? Kindle. They have so many of them now.
Right, but it's available.
Yeah.
And or they could go to my website, which is mhotepthedrum.com.
You know, you have to spell that for some folks. You know that, right? Imhotep.
IMHOTEP dash the drum. www.mhotepthedrum.com.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to go back because you mentioned Argentina. I've been to Argentina, Costa Rica, some more countries, and I want to go back to the nationality question, because a lot of what we equate as race is really about, did you or your ancestors come from nations that were, for example, people who describe themselves as Hispanic were colonized or came from nations that were, you know, subjugated by Spain. And then you have people who describe themselves based on language. You know, I'm Latin, I'm Latino, I'm Latina, I'm Latinx. And they're basically saying, you know, we speak Spanish, we speak a Latin-based language. But that, German is a Latin-based language, French is a Latin-based language, English is a Latin-based language, Italian is a Latin-based language. And so once again, I say you have ethnicity, you have nationality being confused with race, and where we actually have to compete for resources that are supposed to be going to deal with racial issues, and to the point where you have people who self-identify as white when it's to their advantage to do that, but then want to identify along racial lines based on nationality or ethnicity when it comes to getting resources. And so I wish that we would draw a clear line of demarcation so that when we talk about racial justice and dismantling racism and those sort of things, we're not conflating nationalism, ethnicity, and those sort of things. It's kind of like, the great mistake that we made when they came up with minority rights and affirmative action. And we decided that white women were a minority, even though in terms of population, they're the largest group in America, numerically speaking. Now, they may have been a minority when it comes to their participation in the economic sector at one time. And what happened, we know what happened with that. You had a lot of white men who owned businesses who suddenly turned 51% of their business over to their wife, their European wife, and were able to access all of these resources from the federal government, et cetera, for these minority business programs with the Small Business Administration, et cetera. And when you look at today, we have exactly the same thing happening, but we have people who are best described by their nationality, et cetera, but who are getting resources that are desperately needed in communities where people of African descent and other Asians and others who are clearly defined by race and genetics, as opposed to some definition that folks have suddenly come up with because it's advantageous for them to do so as a group, where I can also, on the other side, decide that I want to take advantage of things if I self-identify as white, and that's a huge problem. But you know what I want to do? This is Black History Month. We're coming to an end of this program. We have a few minutes left, but I want to invite you back to do the next program. The next program that we'll be having on the call. If you're comfortable with that, we're going to close out this episode, and I want you to do that by telling people how they can reach you via email, telephone, whatever serves you best, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. My email address is Kwadwo, that's KWAD as in door, WO, 816 at gmail.com. That's Kwadwo 816 at gmail.com. And my website is www.imhotep hyphen the drum at .com.
Okay.
So
well, thank you.
I welcome all communication.
Thank you so much, and I'm hoping that what we have clarified is I'm hoping that this educates people. Carter G. Woodson's famous book, The Miseducation of the Negro, We're not throwing stones at anyone. We're trying to educate people by looking at history, etc., so we can truly address the issue of racism. And we want to thank everyone. Give us your book once again before you go.
The name of the book is Sankofa University, Studying African-Centered History and Culture.
Okay, thank you so much. And anyone who wants to reach us at New Alpha Community Development Corporation can do so by going to our website, www.newalphacdc.com. Once again, www.newalphacdc.com. And so until next week, this time during Black History Month, we're going to talk some more about Black history and why we have to understand our history, not only to deal with racism, but to build power. And we build power by taking direct action, by seeking social justice, by being advocates for the truth, and by taking direct action and each one teaching the other one. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again on the next episode of The Call.